Hello again. I'm Terry Burns, and I'm back to talk to you about more wordplay in John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphia. For my explication, I'm using the translation that Dr. Nancy Turner and I did that came out from Ouroboros Press in 2021. What I want to talk about today, and I'm going to go ahead here and share my screen, is Voarchadamus. And what this is, most obviously, is an allusion to another work, this work, the Voarchadúmia of Panteo, sometimes written as Pantheus, sometimes as Pantheo. And let's see why Dee would want to allude to the Voarchadúmia. A text probably very few of you out there have read, and I have a separate video on it below if you want to know a little bit about it, but I'm going to fast forward to my conclusion, which is the main reason to read it now is to understand the work of John Dee. And in that other video, I think I've told you most of what you need to know about it. I do not encourage you reading it except in translation, honestly. So Voarchadamus, this is what Dee says. He says, and if our hieroglyphic monad's 21st theorem would give satisfaction to a Voarchadamus, himself a minister, speculating upon Voarchadúmia, he will grant that his peregrinations need not take him to India or the Americas for the sake of philosophizing. Okay, what does that mean? Well, first, it's a direct allusion to the Voarchadúmia of Panteo, as I've already said. But Dee was gifted a copy of this in 1559, and it's heavily, heavily annotated. I talk more about that in my other video, but basically, it makes sense that Dee would be annotating it. Pantheo is a generation before Dee, and he is focused on sacred languages and the connection between letter and number. In Hebrew, and he gives two different Hebrew scripts, in Latin, and in a language that he says comes from Enoch, although it's not John Dee and Edward Kelly's Enochian, which they don't even call that, they call it angelic. So back to Pantheo. Pantheo is at pains to say he is not writing a work of alchemy. Now that's a bit strange because unlike with what Dee does, I mean, you can use the physical descriptions that Pantheo gives you. But since Dee didn't have a lot of luck turning physical lead into physical gold, we can say that probably what Pantheo says about metallurgy isn't what Dee is going to be so thrilled about here. There is most obviously a pun here too, along with Voarchadamus to the Voarchadúmia, a pun on magus, a magical adept, and Adam, right in here, Adam. So a magical adept, perhaps a magical adept using an Adamic language, or if you know that red earth and Adam are the same in Hebrew, and you know that Pantheo is playing on that same thing, just not doing it nearly as well as Dee is. So as I mentioned, Dee's Marginalia was written in his copy of Pantheo's work. He probably wrote it in 1559 when he's in that period of, as he will later say, gestation for the monad, and he's also collecting lots of books. And his Marginalia has this symbol, the symbol of the hieroglyphic monad. Now, Pantheo says that Voar is a, quote, primitive Indian particle meaning gold, and the Hebrew words may adumat from two reds. So Pantheo's linguistic claims about this, and he uses the word that actually I probably translate as Chaldean, which makes it an even more ridiculous statement. It's just like no one has found a word like this. And does he know any language spoken in the subcontinent of India? Well, we don't know much about his life, so I guess it's possible, but it's highly, highly, highly unlikely. Now, as for the Hebrew words that he transliterates into Latin, he brings those into the title, and Dee will play upon the title. So Voar is likely to refer to both the word itself, gold, but it's also punning upon the sound of Zoar and the hour sound in Ein Sof hour. Now, I will go on a little digression after I finish talking about this, about how Dee could have known those things. But Bet, of course, is It's Hebrew for house. It's also just the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And Adumat is a plural for something that we've already below had a wordplay video on, red earth and Adam. So here, which it can also mean red. It wouldn't be pronounced as Adam. It's more likely Edom. But so we have the plural, two reds. There are ways, if you wanted to, with the two reds, that you can also then link that to the Timaeus, but I'm not going to do that here. If you want to read the Voarchadúmia, I highly suggest you do it in translation. Again, Paul Ferguson has a very good 2010 translation. And today we look at the Voarchadúmia mainly for how it influenced Dee. This is, by the way, the work that has an Enochian alphabet. It is not the same alphabet as Dee and Kelly's. Until some scholars, and here I'm thinking of Hilda Norgren, looked more closely at the copy in the British Library. Many people thought, oh, Dee is poring over the Voarchadúmia because he's looking at Enochian, and that's where the Enochian came from. But no, what he's doing in that marginalia is he's comparing two works of Pantheos. I'll talk about that in a moment. But here's where I get to digress, and I apologize for venting, but there are a number of scholars who still would say, how could Dee know anything about the Ein Sof, or he doesn't even know the Sefer Yetzirah? And okay, write me below why you think that. If you're one of those scholars, I'll take all comers, because I can show you probably the copy he had, but I can also reverse engineer from how he does Kabbalistic workings and the things he does that he had a copy of the Sefer Yetzirah. Now, some of the most important works Dee had, he didn't list in his catalog. If you know the catalog of Dee's works that came out recently, there are some like the Codex Marcianus who no one knew that Dee had. They were too important for him to list. Now, with the Zohar, I think that he had access to a copy, but there, I have to admit, I could be wrong. This pun could just be an accident, but I don't think it is. Anyway, let me talk about Voarchadamus a little bit more. So we might ask ourselves, just given this quote here, what does the 21st theorem have to do with the Voarchadúmia of Panteo? Also the 20th theorem, that's his kind of mystical hypercube, hypersphere that he doesn't have a language for in English. So you have to be understanding what he's doing with the monad in the book of Revelation and the cube he makes out of his monad symbol to get it. But if you guess, for example, that it will have something to do with the power of a symbol to be taken apart, manipulated, flipped around, put back together in different orders, and resurrected to heal the world, good, you're right, it's a golem. That is literally what Dee is going to do. And it is in that strange process, I think, that he comes across things that he never expected to come across. This is not the only place he alludes to Pantheo, as I've already said a couple of times. So let's take a look at other places, particularly this bit of gematria in Pantheo that he likes. Remember the last video, we saw this iteration of the monad that doesn't have a dot in the middle when we were talking about Gemea and the center of the center and that kind of thing. Link to that's below if you haven't seen it. But there, Dee says, here by God's will produced this Gemea, this thing over here, a word that to the Parisians I interpreted as Gamos Gaian, the earth of marriage, or as the terrestrial seal of this conjugal influence. When it's produced, it can no longer be fed and watered in its native earth until the fourth great and truly metaphysical revolution be completed. That finite progress being made, he who has fed metamorphosizes, changes into something else. First he will go away, and then after he will most rarely be seen by mortal eyes. All right, I had a whole video talking about what is meant in terms of wordplay by a Gemea doing that. But I didn't talk at all about this by God's will, because lots of people talk about God's will. Okay. In Latin, Dee writes this in a really weird way, though. He writes it as de nutu. That does not translate with the same gematria or the same exact meaning into English. So Dr. Turner and I, in our translation, did what you do when you can't directly translate something. We gave a long footnote, and I'm going to explain that here. De nuto, by the way, he writes it in caps, small caps, every time, caps, small caps. And in his letter to the printer, which is one place where he writes this, he says, you know, don't change any little dot I make. Don't change it. Don't change a jot or tittle. Okay. Jot or tittle, is that how you say that? You can tell me below, because, you know, I have trouble pronouncing words in my own language sometimes. Okay. Dee also uses this in the 77th aphorism of the Voarchadúmia aphoristica in his letter to the printer, like I said. But let's look at this. The 77th aphorism of the Voarchadúmia aphoristica and in his letter to the printer. 7 is a real important number to Dee. And so in the 77th aphorism out of over 200 in the Voarchadúmia, that's pretty significant to just drop God's will in there in this weird Latin form. In the printer, letter to the printer, and in theorem 17 of the monads. 17 is a pretty significant theorem. There are many other common ways in Latin of saying God's will. The most common is De voluntas. You see that all over the place. It happens that Pantheo is using this phrase, which really means like God nodded and it was so. So again, why? Well, in another work of his, which I'm going to abbreviate here as Ars Metallica because it has a very long title that basically means like the art and theory of the transmutations of metal with the Voarchadúmia. And yes, that's where he has gematria exercises and so on. Pantheo makes a lot of the Latin gematria of this phrase. So as Ferguson points out in his translation of the Voarchadúmia, in Latin gematria, nutu is going to be 72. That's an important processional number. De, not D, to 18, although believe me, Dee is punning his name on DEI a lot. So 72 and 18 is 90. So that's significant, as you can tell from Dee's marginalia, that because in Latin, where there are lots of different words actually for different ways of breaking up the alchemical process, the ones that Pantheo is getting will also equal 90. So you'll have 42 plus 30 and 18 is 90. But the one I'm more interested in is the 72, especially if you look at the transmutation of time as a kind of alchemy, as is done in Timaeus or as is done in the Metamorphosis, time changing into a golden age. So 72 is the number that if you're looking up at the stars, that it takes a fixed star to process 1 degree. 72 years. That's also why it's sometimes considered the measure of a man, and also, if you take a circle and divide it by 5, you get 72. Time and space measures, by the time we get near the end of the monad, will become the same. I mean, 365 years and 360 degrees are very, very, very roughly the same with some of the calculations that we're doing. That's also why modern mathematicians would not agree with Dee that he's squaring the circle. We're estimating how to square the circle when we get to that point. But 72 times 5 will give you 360 degrees. 5 will be important as a pentagram and pentagon and so forth. All right, that's all I got for you today, folks. See you again soon. Bye-bye.